lecture series organized by Kathmandu University School of Management, MPPM Scholars Network. My name is Ram Chalmakar, and I'm a MPPM scholar at Kathmandu University School of Management.
Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Richa Paani. I'm helping Ramji through this dialogue. And I'm also an MPPM scholar at Kathmandu University School of Management, KUSUM in its abbreviation. KUSUM has established its brand as the pioneer of public policy program in Nepal. It has been running the Masters of Public Policy and Management program since August 2019. The program aims to deal with a wide range of public policy and governance issues, along with enhancing management knowledge and skills of the public sector for effective service delivery. The MPPM Scholars Network is a student-led public policy discussion platform within KUSUM that has been organizing regular public policy discourses through this initiative called Tomorrow's Policy Leaders for Public Dialogue. The dialogue series aims to bring together public policy leaders and experts around the world and focus on emerging issues that are important for Nepal's prosperity.
This event is being organized in collaboration with Fulbright Alumni Association of Nepal. I'm Soedi's development partner and Nepal Policy Research Network. I would like to thank all the collaborators for supporting us to organize such events. The theme for today's episode is today's episode of public lecture series is social justice movement in the United States with reflections for Nepal organizations, public policy, and science. To talk about this theme, we have a special guest today, Professor Jonathan K. London from California, USA. We'll introduce him briefly.
Professor Jonathan K. London. He's an associate professor at University of California, Davis Department of Human Ecology, Community and Regional Development. He's also the faculty director at UC Davis Center for Regional Change and co-director at Community Engagement Core, UC Davis Environmental Health Science Center. Dr. Jonathan is an educator, researcher, and community builder with over 25 years of experience in participatory research, rural community development, and community engaged planning. He holds a BA in Environmental Studies from Brown University, a master's degree in City and Regional Planning, and a PhD in Environmental Science Policy and Management from UC Berkeley. His research addresses conflicts and collaboration in natural resource and environmental management with a particular emphasis on environmental justice in rural communities. He directs the UC Davis Center for Regional Change, which serves as a catalyst for multidisciplinary research and that informs efforts to build healthy, prosperous, equitable, and sustainable regions in California and beyond. He first worked in Nepal in 1991, developing a youth education program on ecological and cultural change with the Annapurna Conservation Area project, and currently co-directs a learning exchange program that brings UC Davis and Nepalese university students together for project-based learning in Nepal. Thank you and a warm welcome to Professor Jonathan in this event.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Jonathan, for accepting our invitation and joining this session. So before we hear from you, I'd like to request our MPPM Program Director, Associate Professor Dr. Purna Nepali to share his valuable remarks. Purna sir, so over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Ramji, Richaji, and Avinashi for organizing this wonderful event. And first of all, I'd like to welcome Professor Jonathan London and very distinguished participants I have been noticing. I hope after the presentation of the Jonathan London, very important insights from very distinguished participants. We are expecting from them as well, so that we'll enrich the whole debate and dialogue. And it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Jonathan London to deliver very wonderful speech on social justice and comparative analysis of the United States and Nepal. And at this stage, I would like to take these opportunities to say that Kathmandu University School of Management is running very pioneer program in public policy, governance, and management. And as a part of this program, we are also running the different dialogue series. And today we are organizing student-led engagement and policy initiatives. And through these students, they will be the tomorrow's leaders. And through the students' very active engagements, it will enhance the leadership capacity of the students. And through their very wonderful initiatives, and we are trying to connect between academia and non-academia, and how can we reach out to the different state agencies and different kind of the agencies, and they are also very powerful in influencing the policy. And focusing on this kind of the good connection between academia and non-academia, and we'll be able to influence the whole public institution and whole public policy making process. And as a part of this program, and we have one specialized in social policy and social justice, and this is very much undermined in our public affairs. And also as a part of the whole prosperity debate and dialogue, the whole journey, and these issues are also being undermined in context to the Nepal, not only in context to the Nepal, even in United States, in different part of the world. Environment justice and social justice all are very much undermined. And so that how can we bring this issue at the forefront. And also we should be able to recognize the very movement actors. They are very also powerful in academia. They are also are being very undermined. Their voice, their interests and issues are very pertinent to influence the whole social policy and public policy. And focusing on all those things, and we have one specialized in social policy and justice. I hope this dialogue series will bring a lot of issues so that our public policy will be very robust and vibrant. And hoping all those things, we are expecting a lot so that we'll be able to influence the whole public policy making process. And without any delay, and I would like to request Ramji to move ahead. And I would like to welcome Jonathan and all distinguished participants here. Thank you so much, Ramji, and over to you, please.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable remarks. So now we are going to start our formal session. The formal presentation will be of 30 to 35 minutes. So after the presentation, we'll have a question, answer, and discussion session. The participants can use hand raise option for the queries and questions. So once we announce your name, you can unmute yourself and ask your directly to the speaker. You can also drop your queries and questions in the chat box. We will monitor that as well. For your information, we are also live through Kusum MPPM Scholars Network Facebook page and YouTube channel as well. So throughout this session, we will be using the English medium in this event. So without further delay, I would like to request our speaker, Professor Jonathan K. London, to start his presentation. So Professor Jonathan, the floor is yours now.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Professor Paani Nepali ji, Ram ji, and Rita ji for your wonderful support for putting this talk together, and for all of you for participating. I'm going to shift over to share my screen here so you can see my slides. So I'm going to be talking about social justice with a particular focus on environmental justice, and as was described, really looking at the relationships between these three dimensions of communities and social movements, public policy, and science. So just to give you a little sense of who I am, my biography was kindly read earlier by Risha Ji. But just to say just a little bit about that. So I was raised in a fishing town on the east coast of the United States. And I, right after college, began my professional career in Nepal, as was mentioned, working with Annapurna Conservation Area Project in Gandruk. So that's just a picture of Gandruk. Probably many of you have been there. And more recently, I've been running this learning exchange. So I've been very fortunate to have a long connection with Nepal, and I feel just very, very privileged and very pleased to be able to have that as part of my life. Although I've been doing this work as an educator for many years, I haven't done research until quite recently in Nepal. So the things I'm going to be presenting are preliminary and are part of my ongoing learning. So I'll bring you into that process with me, and I'll really welcome your questions and suggestions. So I've always worked in interdisciplinary settings in a way that connects research and social action, and I do that through the nonprofit sector and then through the university. So today I want to share with you a talk with three basic goals. So the first is to introduce the concept of environmental justice. What is that? And I'll be abbreviating that EJ. That's something that probably a number of you are familiar with and others not. So I will sort of begin that with an introduction. I'll be talking about these three dimensions of environmental justice as a part of social justice. And so that is the social movements, policy, and science, with a sort of a reflection back and forth between the development of that in Nepal and in the United States. So just to lay the groundwork, what is environmental justice? So it is a goal. It's an ideal state in which there's an achievement of equitable protection from environmental harms and provision of environmental benefits, with a focus on marginalized populations of many kinds, as you can see here. You know that you're pursuing and eventually achieving environmental justice based on the answers to these three questions. So who benefits and who is harmed? So it's sort of questions of distribution. Who has power in decision-making? So that's a question of authority. Whose knowledge and experiences are respected? So not just scientific knowledge, but local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, embodied knowledge, all of those are part of environmental justice. And then ultimately, who is included in these thriving, sustainable, and equitable communities. So this is the vision of environmental justice. Why is this important? I find it's important, but I want to suggest to you there's three basic reasons for that. So the first is that environmental justice addresses the most pressing social and environmental conditions and challenges in the world. So whether we're talking about climate change or access to water or air pollution and so on, these are things that truly have a life or death impact. As well as social issues like marginalization and inclusion and exclusion. It also is this sort of way of synthesizing or creating a holistic frame to look at issues and populations that might otherwise seem separate from each other, but actually when you look at them together, you can see these underlying sources of injustice, whether that's the impact of the state, of the government, the impact of the economy, impact of social hierarchies and inequities. Through the environmental lens, you can see clearly what those underlying forces are. And then ultimately, while it does focus particularly on marginalized populations, it is something that we all need to care about. We won't be able to literally survive as a species unless everyone is able to thrive. So as I've mentioned now a couple times, there are these three dimensions of environmental justice. So there's social movements at the top of the screen. There's public policy, and I'll describe each of these in more detail as we go. And then there's the field of scholarship. So when people say, I'm interested in environmental justice, or I do work in environmental justice, and when I say that, I mean that I'm interested in looking at these three elements: social movements, policies, and science or scholarship. So those are just images from the United States, but I'm going to share with you, as I say, preliminary understandings of things that are happening in Nepal, where you also, of course, have very strong social movements. You have very active government at the federal level, and at the provincial and district level as well. And you have a quite old and well-established history of environmental justice scholarship. And this is a bibliography on environmental justice, including by one of the participants in today's talk, Dr. Jagannath Adhikari and his colleague Sharad Gimre, back in 2002. So this has been, there's a long history in Nepal of environmental justice. So I'm going to first talk about the USA, and then I'm going to move to Nepal. So if we want to understand environmental injustice, it's important to look at those drivers. What are the forces that are creating environmental injustice? So in the United States, we sometimes say we have these two original sins that our country was founded on and continue to challenge us to this day. So we're what some people call the settler colonial state. So we had, tens of millions of indigenous people living in what is now the United States, and with European conquest, that number was brought down to a bare fraction. So truly genocide, and the results of that continue to this day. We also were formed on the basis of enslaved Africans who built the economy and built the initial economic structures that created the wealth of this country through the slavery system. And those kinds of injustices, as I say, are historical, many centuries ago, but continue to this day in different forms. One of the reasons why these kinds of factors of environmental justice have continued is because of racialized segregation. So of where, say, African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans, where originally where they were allowed to live legally was separate from white people, and in places that were seen as less desirable, next to environmental hazards, factories, railroads, these kinds of things. And so you have, continuing to this day, this maldistribution of environmental hazards and environmental benefits based on these racial systems. We've also had a government system that's structurally and systematically excluded people of color, the term that we use for non-white people of color, until quite recently. For example, well into this century, people of color, African Americans and so on, weren't even allowed to vote. Native Americans weren't even considered citizens of the country that was truly their country. And inclusive of just the marginalization of low-income people, people of color, indigenous people in government policy and decision-making. And we have an advanced capitalist system, which in my view is inherently exploitative of both land and labor. And we have one of the most pronounced and inequitable forms of capitalism in the world. So in that context, environmental justice movements sprung up starting in the 1980s. One of the first struggles that's considered the real birth of the environmental justice movement was in the Southeast, in the state of North Carolina, a county called Warren County. This was predominantly African American, predominantly low income. And this was a site that was targeted by the state government for a toxic waste dump. And the people there rose up and said, we don't accept this. And they lay down in front of the trucks, and they didn't allow the waste to be dumped, and they worked for decades to be able to protect their community, and that effort continues to this day. Closer to me here in California was a battle over a small town called Kettleman City. This is a site of the second largest toxic waste dump in the entire country. And it's located right outside of a small town with that are predominantly farm workers. And most of those are Latinos, that is people who come from Mexico and Central America. The toxic waste has been suspected of being a source of all kinds of health impacts, including birth defects and babies dying in childbirth. And it's also been the site of community organizing over decades. One of the key moments in the development of the environmental justice movement in the United States was a summit back in 1991. It's called the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And they created this set of principles of environmental justice. And this is from their preamble to those principles. I won't read it all here, but they talk about being this multinational grouping. They talk about fighting the destruction and taking of our lands and communities. They talk about the spiritual interdependence and sacredness of Mother Earth, celebrating all these different kinds of cultures and languages and beliefs. They talk about economic alternatives to the exploitative systems of the day. They talk about issues of this 500 years of colonization and oppression. So they really taking this very broad, holistic view, as I say, these drivers of environmental injustice, and they are committing themselves to a movement to address those really profound social and environmental struggles. Environmental justice is, as I say, a sort of a thread of social justice, and it's itself formed by multiple other strands or streams. So that includes everything from civil rights to labor, anti-toxins, anti-poverty, environmental conservation, indigenous rights, the activist scholars, and all of those over time have woven together, and to form this larger environmental justice movement. And I believe and have seen in the research and my own experience that this is one thing that makes the movement so powerful and also so interesting to study, because it does bring together all of these elements, and it's complex, and you really need to understand how these pieces fit together. The environmental justice movement also addresses a wide variety of issues, which makes sense since they're coming from all of these different distinct social movements. So everything from water and air and agricultural pesticides, climate change, occupational health, toxic waste, air pollution, indigenous rights. So in some ways, these are separate issues with separate struggles, but environmental justice creates this frame in which all of those can be seen as themselves in different ways. And to be able to address those different issues, you need to deal with the core, that sort of center point of that Venn diagram, which is environmental justice. So that's kind of the social movement dimension. In terms of public policy, the real groundwork for this was set in 1994. So just a couple years, 3 years after that summit that I mentioned. And so the government really had to catch up with the social movements. It took them, as I say, several years before the first environmental justice policy was established. And this is what was called an executive order. It's not a law, but it's an order issued by the president. At that time, it was President Bill Clinton. And he signed this executive order 12898 and said that the federal government must address these disproportionate impacts on people of color and low-income people, and it must make sure that those people are included in decision-making that can affect their lives and their health and well-being. Since that time, over the last 2 decades, There have been a wide variety of environmental justice laws, very little at the federal level, which is a real problem. And that may start to change with our new presidential administration under Joe Biden. But a lot of the EJ work has happened at the state level, and particularly in California, where there's been legislation on everything from climate change to pesticides to water quality, air quality, all with an environmental justice orientation, and all very much driven by the social movements themselves. They really are the ones putting the pressure on the government. And then finally, science. So back in 1987, there was a study called Toxic Waste and Race. This cover is from the study 20 years afterwards. But that original study looked at where toxic waste dumps are located and where African-American populations are located, and saw a very close match. And that was this development of this understanding of environmental racism, the ways in which racism intersected with environmental quality. And that pattern has continued, and the scholarship has continued to document that mapping on of social inequity and environmental inequity. But then over the decades, it's expanded. The science now also looks at the reasons why those kinds of patterns exist. Understanding the dynamics of racism, of classism, of capitalism, of the way that the state operates, of settler colonialism. What are all the drivers, as I showed in that earlier slide, of environmental justice? And then in the last 10 years or so, there's been this explosion of scholarship looking at new issues, new population groups, new places, new scales. So it's a very dynamic time to be an environmental justice scholar, and I would encourage you, the students in the Zoom here, to consider this as something that that you might take on as your own work, as students of public policy. That environmental justice has such a vibrant and vital place in public policy. So so in terms of that interaction, as I mentioned a little bit, the scholarship really came up after the activism had started. So it was an attempt to understand the activism, and in many cases to support the activism, to provide research that could be useful for the social movements. In terms of the relationship between social movements and government, it's typically been very conflictual, with the social movements either pushing the government to take action to protect them, as well as to critique the things that they're doing that are harming these communities. And then finally, in terms of environmental justice scholarship, we really look at both the role of the state, or otherwise known as the government, in the way that intersects with environmental justice, and also the role of capitalism and economic inequality and that's impact on environmental injustice. So that's really those 3 points: social movements, policy, and the science or scholarship. So I'm going to shift now to Nepal. Take a quick drink. And I emphasizing again, this is preliminary. This is based on a scan of the environmental justice literature. I'm obviously here in the United States under COVID, so haven't been able to be on the ground in Nepal to be able to do in-person research. So it's been at a distance, and I've with 2 graduate students, Sadiksha Bandari and Gaurav Thapa, have done a review of the relevant literature, and we've also interviewed a number of the leading academics. A couple of them, maybe more, are on the phone here. I saw Dr. Jagannath Adhikari and Dr. Hemant Ojha here. So we interviewed a number of leading scholars, such as those prominent scholars, and this analysis is based on that analysis. So first, what are some of the driving factors of environmental justice in Nepal? I've talked about what that looks like in the United States. So here, we have this deep history, of course, millennia longer than the United States, a deep history of historic and systemic discrimination based on a number of different factors. Many of those are similar in the United States, ethnicity and class, but of course you also have the significant factor of caste, the issues of language, geography, nationality, gender, and other factors. And as I say, with that kind of history, this is a very complex, deeply rooted set of dynamics that need to be understood. There's great concentration of land and resources by political, social, and economic elites that create a very small group that has a very vast array of the resources available, and a very large group that has very few resources. And this is not unlike the United States either, not to point fingers, but just to say this is an important factor to understand injustice in Nepal. Land ownership and resource ownership is heavily gendered, and that has a major impact on access to resources and livelihood. There's rapid industrialization, of course, and many of these things I'm telling you that you know. So with rapid industrialization, there's both environmental impacts as well as concentrated benefits and costs. A lot of that industrialization causes environmental hazards because of inadequate environmental controls and regulations. There's very impressive and very exciting democratic innovations in Nepal. I am truly in awe of what the country has been able to achieve in such a short time, a short development of its democratic process, and yet is challenged, like many places, to have a fully democratic and inclusionary system. And then something that is, I think, particularly relevant in Nepal and other developing countries, a very large impact of international donors, whether those are development banks or countries or aid agencies. So these are some of those driving factors. So I want to just lay out some of the scholarship, some of the key concepts of environmental justice in Nepal. So first from Guimaret's work, which was an early review of environmental justice back in 2006. He talks about the way in which environmental justice in Nepal can be understood as environmentalism of the poor. That's a phrase that was developed by Joan Martinez Alier and others that described an environmentalism based on livelihoods, based on access to resources, ability to sustain oneself, and less so on the impacts of industrialization, but in this much more personal survival way. Acharya and Upreti also talk about this in terms of decision-making and access to resources as opposed to this consequence of environmental issues. And I'll argue that this is changing significantly, but this is some of the initial framing of environmental justice in Nepal. Belbazi talks about the legal structures and makes, I think, a really strong normative argument about the need for the Constitution to be able to be inclusive of all of these different groups, women, Dalits, indigenous people, Madeshis, politically and economically weak people who depend on these resources for their livelihood and are often excluded from decision-making about the management and control of those resources, unless all of those people are included, unless their well-being is taken into consideration, this kind of injustice will not come to an end. So looking now at the different kinds of issues happening in Nepal around environmental justice, you can see similarly, some similar issues to the United States, but some unique ones as well. So you have issues of access to resources by indigenous people, people of marginalized castes, issues of water access and water pollution, community forestry, and that's something that I would say is quite unique and distinct about Nepal. We'll talk a little bit more about that compared to the United States. disasters and climate change, industrial pollution, solid waste, and of course, air pollution. Again, none of these issues are new to you, but what I want to suggest that may be new is the way in which to think about how all those issues come together and can be understood in a holistic way as being driven by those same forces of inequity and expressed in different ways. But if we don't understand that underlying logic, we'll see these as separate phenomenon, but we won't see the interconnections. Why does water pollution and water access look the way it does? And how can we understand that better if we understand why air pollution functions the way that it does, why industrial pollution affects marginalized people in the ways that it does. This is the frame, this is the value of environmental justice, to be able to bring these issues together, both to understand them and then eventually to take action on them. So let's look at just some of those issues individually. So in terms of resource access and cultural sovereignty for Indigenous people, Nepal has very impressive protected areas and wildlife conservation and biodiversity conservation, but it comes at a cost. And scholars such as Jana lay out that cost in terms of these state-imposed exclusionary conservation policies and practices, disregarding Indigenous communities of what they need for livelihood. And then he also says we need to democratize and restructure protected area management to allow secure the rights of Indigenous people. So this is, again, a real innovation in Nepal to include people, but the critique from Nepali scholars is that that really hasn't happened sufficiently. In terms of community forestry, again, a very important innovation in Nepal, and something to be, justifiably quite proud of. And at the same time, there are some significant problems, and scholars such as Hemant Ojha, who I believe is on the phone, or at least was earlier, or on the call, talks about a romanticization of community forestry that misses some of those underlying social and environmental inequities, whether that's about gender or caste or class and other factors. Also, this issue of being really pushed and conceptualized and managed by external donors, international donors, and INGOs, and others in ways that aren't as reflective and sensitive to the needs of local people. And from a policy perspective, people like Vani and others talking about how that kind of governance structure needs to be really reworked for this to be a truly environmental justice-oriented community forestry. Industrial pollution, increasing problem in Nepal, as many other lesser industrialized countries rapidly industrialize for good reasons, to be able to deal with poverty alleviation, be able to provide jobs and other important resources, but it comes at a significant cost. And some of that is because of limited regulation. So one thing to have a factory, it's another thing to be able to have one that has adequate environmental controls so that the people living near it and downwind of it, like this brick kiln picture, won't be affected in the same way that a cleaner industrial facility might. But there are these externalities where local residents, farmers, the environment around them are heavily affected. Just one example there of distillery, Karnali Distillery, and creating near Nepalganj, creating generations of impact on the local environment, on the local economy, and people's health. Water. So water rights and water pollution. So truly a water of suffering. So there's significant issues with water. Water here in California, we're launching into a second year of drought. In Nepal, you obviously have your own issues of water. So many factors are troubling the water in Nepal. You have significant water privatization, a lot of the rural to urban water transfers, of course, things like Malamchi and others, which provide a lot of benefit, but you have to ask on what terms are these happening and who is benefiting and who is bearing the costs of these kinds of transfers. Construction that provides some benefits of water and electricity, but the distributional questions of those who are being displaced by the dams needs to be considered. Mining for construction materials in rivers, again, providing the houses and buildings that people depend on, but also having a major impact on fisheries and the communities that depend on those fish for their livelihoods. So a number of different issues there in terms of the resource extraction. And then at the site of consumption, high water rates, uneven water access, the degrading of common pool resources. And then at the production side, in terms of agriculture, Nepal, as many places, has a very rich and vibrant set of customary common pool resource management that unfortunately can be really degraded as the more commercialized, privatized systems take over. And those are typically the most marginalized people who depend on those systems and therefore are the most affected when those corporatized state-managed systems take over. Air pollution, you know better than anyone about the air pollution in Nepal, and particularly in Kathmandu. This article here, 7th most polluted city in the world, but also Nepal 177th out of 180 in terms of the air quality pollution index. So a major issue, again, not telling you anything you don't know, but from an environmental justice frame, you need to ask not just what's the problem overall, but what's the problem for the most marginalized groups. So this is where we think about, outdoor workers, people who live near roadways, people who must, walk to work, that don't have the nice, air-conditioned cars, who don't have air conditioning in their homes, for example, and are breathing in the air in a much more direct way than those who can buffer themselves at work and at home. So that's that issue of disparity. Waste management. So the increased use of non-compostable, non-biodegradable waste products, plastics and other things, coupled with lack of adequate municipal trash pickups leads to this significant backing up of solid waste, the open pit burning of waste, the impacts on the people, often marginalized caste and women, street sweepers, that have these major occupational hazards, as well as these larger environmental hazards in the trash burning. And then natural disasters, and I put that in quotes because while they're natural in a sense that they are falling from the sky as rain, for example, as a natural occurrence, they're not natural in that human-caused developments are greatly exacerbating that, whether that is, creation of impervious surfaces, the destruction of forests, the penning in of rivers. All of these things create a much greater degree of flooding. And when you look at climate change, of course, the ultimate human-caused unnatural natural disaster, this, again, from an environmental justice lens, is affecting the most marginalized people in a disproportionate way. Because they don't have options, they're living in low-lying areas, they're dependent on the environment in a different way, they're not included often in decision-making, and there's a real need recognized for a greater emphasis on resilience and sustainability and inclusion around climate change. So now looking at, having looked at environmental justice in the United States and environmental justice from an issue perspective in Nepal, how can we reflect on these two cases to help us understand both, looking in the mirror between Nepal and the United States. So first off, I want to challenge the dichotomy between what people like Martinez Alier talked about of the environmentalism of the poor versus environmentalism of the industrialized countries. And I think it's important to really pull that apart. So in Nepal, and probably a number of you are part of these movements, there are significant elements of environmental justice, which is not only about livelihoods, where this protest here, again, maybe some of you were part of these Friday climate protests, climate justice protests by young people in Kathmandu. So thinking about global climate change, thinking about the impacts of industrialization in ways that look quite similar to the United States and other industrialized countries. And at the same time, in the United States, we have indigenous people, although it's been a genocidal society. There's a large and vibrant and very very crucial presence of indigenous people to this day. This is an image of a Ojibwe tribe, a woman from the Ojibwe tribe in our state of Minnesota, and her sign says "Right to Rice," and the indigenous people there have a millennia-old traditions of wild rice harvesting, and they're really trying to keep out industrialized rice and industrialized rice production to not destroy their cultural lifeways, their cultural ecological lifeways. And so you could say that looks somewhat similar to indigenous peoples' work on resource and cultural sovereignty in Nepal. So I think it's really valuable not to put our countries in these sort of diametrically opposed conditions, but look at what are some of the similar kinds of characteristics that we can look at to understand both societies. So looking at a little bit of a conceptual level, then you have, sorry, just looking at my clock here. You have the work in Nepal, where there's often a separation by issue, whereas in the United States, it can be more synthesized. In Nepal, you have the constitutional right to clean and healthy environment. In the United States, we don't have that, whereas in Nepal, there's less specific EJ legislation, and we have more of that here. In Nepal, there's a very important environmental justice scholar network connected with communities, and similar in the US, although that tends to be more environmental justice wide. So what are the things that we can learn, US from Nepal? So in the US, I think we can integrate more of a livelihoods and resource and cultural sovereignty approach, which has been developed well in Nepal. We can look at the possibility of constitutional protections, and we can use some of the work that in Nepal you're doing on what we call affirmative action or reserve seats in parliament, or on for community forestry user committees and things like that. I think in Nepal you could learn from the US. First, I would just say, when you're looking for other models from other places, ground it still in the realities of Nepal. It's not about adopting a model in whole cloth. It's about looking for things that are useful for your context. But I would say that the idea of a more holistic framework of environmental justice could be useful to bring all those different issue areas together, and also to continue to do the work of engaging young people like many of you here on the call. So thank you so much. I'll close there and look forward to your questions and discussion. Again, Dr. Paani Nepali, for your kind invitation, and your colleagues for helping to set this up. I do want to thank all of the environmental justice scholars who we were able to speak with, listed out here. My research assistants, both students from Nepal working with me here at UC Davis, Sadiksha Bandari and Gaurav Thapa, and of course, all of you here today. I think you'll all have my slides, which will have my contact information. And I've also included a brief bibliography, or sort of a select bibliography of environmental justice sources that we consulted about Nepal. We have many others, but these are the ones specifically that we consulted. And then just a small list of those sources for from the United States that you might find of interest. So I will stop there and turn it back to our colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jonathan. I think it was a really comprehensive and it allowed us to reflect on, the often left out environmental justice issues. Now I would like to open up questions from our participants. So I would request everyone to use the hand raise button. And once we have that, I will call out the names for questions. And you can unmute yourself when I call out your names. Okay, we have Rihanna Ji. And then we can go to Jagannath, sir.
Thank you, Professor Jonathan. So that was a very insightful presentations, and maybe I would give a bit of my introduction. So actually, I'm Rehana Srestra, and actually I did my PhD from Netherlands, University of Twente, and my topic of in my PhD was to look into, or let's say to investigate how the GIS-based tools and technologies could actually help in enhancing the dialogue between various fields in relation to environmental inequality. So let's say a part of environmental justice. So in my PhD, I actually developed GIS-based mapping tools and actually did my workshop with stakeholders from health and urban planning background, because we see that health and urban planning, these are two different fields, but has such a great impact when we look into environmental justice. These two fields can actually integrate, but yet in the current debate, so these two fields, whether it is in science or in practice, they are actually working quite in a silos approach. So we thought that I tried to look into how this environmental, how this GIS tools and technologies could actually help in the dialogue or between different fields. So and right now I'm based in University of Bremen, so in Department of Social Epidemiology, and I'm associated with the project which is called Digital Public Health. And as a part of my cluster, I'm trying to investigate what kind of tools and technologies or digital application could be used or could be taken further in the integration of health and urban field. And one of the field that I'm trying to look into environmental justice or environmental inequalities. So my point is, like, as I told you that, so they're especially looking at health and urban planning fields. These two fields should actually be integrated, or they should be working together, but it doesn't happen. So so they are still working. We are still facing challenges, and how these two fields could be actually bring into or integrated. So, and what kind of technology or what should be the approach to break such kind of silos mentality. So maybe you can just just say your thoughts. So what do you say? Because I'm also quite a bit familiar with your work when I was doing my PhD. So maybe you can give a bit insights into that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rahana. Those are really good remarks and insights. Yeah, I would just say that I think the GIS mapping and this socio-ecological mapping is really an important approach, and I've done a lot of that in my work. I didn't have time to share that tonight, but I think that that's something that is really cutting edge science, to look at the cumulative impacts of all of those different kinds of factors, not just looking at, say, the impact of pesticides or water quality or air quality on people's lives, but all of those things, how they come together, and it's complex. And so the GIS can really help us visualize that and analyze that. I also agree. I think the whole field of urban planning is sort of it was sort of behind a number of the pieces that I mentioned about water and air and so on. But there is the whole field of urban planning, of course. And I think that increasingly they're getting more involved in environmental justice, as are public health. I think, there's a lot of work. We have here in the United States, the American Public Health Association, APHA, and they have a major emphasis on environmental justice at this point. That's as well as racial justice and racialized health disparities. So I think those are two professions that are increasingly engaged in environmental justice. So I think that's very important to point that out. So thank you for your comment.
Jagannath, sir.
Hello. Thanks,
Hello.
Jonathan, for this comprehensive comparison of environmental justice issues in United States and Nepal. That's very useful, and it's personally useful for me, as it helped to refresh my knowledge on environmental justice. So this is very good. When I did some research on environmental justice, it was a long time ago, 96, 97. So when Bill Clinton signed that executive order, and then there was interest all over the world. You see how this policies work at the global level. So yeah, people were interested to do some work in Nepal. And so I got an opportunity. It was a new concept for me at that time. So we prepared that bibliography. But interestingly, at that time, there was, Nepalese scholars, and the scholarship on Nepal wasn't using this term environmental justice. Justice was quite common, but not linking between environmental problems and justice issues. So yeah, if one looks into that bibliography, one can find out many researches that deal with distribution of environmental benefits, even the distribution of environmental cost, who gets, which people gets what, which people get what detrimental impact. So yeah, people were doing that kind of things even before this concept came to Nepal, but not using the concept of environmental justice. But later on, I found out that this concept was very useful to kind of link like the who gets what in terms of benefit, in terms of cost, environmental benefit, and then why it happens. All the question of decision-making, power and knowledge, who has the power, who has knowledge, and how these are linked to the social categories, and who are involved in the decision, and what decision making impacts on the distribution of benefit and cost. So, this whole process then became very interesting to us. So I found it very interesting, and I hope it excites a new generation of researchers to do more research on this issue, because the issue has been changing in Nepal too. Now, Nepal is becoming more urbanized, so there are urban issues. Urban planning is becoming an issue that we heard from previous speaker, Rehana. And then new environmental problems coming out from industries, solid waste in urban areas, and how these solid waste are environmental cost and where it goes, and then who bear the cost. And there's a question of justice. Then the real question of justice in Nepal until now, maybe in other places too, is thought as a legal justice. And there are question of whether legal justice is enough or not, unless we are careful, concerned with the health and benefit of other people. It is a moral thing as well. And for humanity, love for others, empathy, I mean, these are also has to come into justice issue, because just legal justice becomes very mechanical and people are not concerned with it. So what is happening in all developed countries too. So in Nepal also, as you said, Jonathan, you said that in terms of constitutional rights, in terms of policy, maybe Nepal is ahead of United States. In the Constitution, we have given rights to environment, food sovereignty, rights to indigenous resource, cultural sovereignty. So these are the things we have in the policy. About the questions have come about implementation. And then it could be a good research field for the new students on this issue of science and the policy. And then yeah, there's policy making one thing, and how policy making is informed by the science, and then the question of implementation. For this, I guess the previous previous speaker Rehana said about silo mentality not coming together, and so we need new tools to bring science and policy interaction, implementation, integrating different disciplines, urban planning, public health, and all these things integrating, and then they talk to each other. New tools for the policymakers and the researchers come together so that they can undertake conversation, and then in the conversation, then the question comes up, social inclusion, who are to be involved, who can influence the decision making. So these are very important and crucial issues, and that's linked to the environment and also to the politics. So this is a very vibrant field, and be very useful for the future. And I think our young students will get involved to this, and it will lead to some concrete benefits for the marginalized people. Because in our society, I say, if we think of marginalized people, and if they have the benefits, then we can rest assured that the upper class people, wealthier people, powerful people, they have already got benefited. So we can make sure that, I mean, that makes sure. So we always look into the marginalized people. So if they get benefits, then the upper class people would have already got the benefit. So this is one way why we are interested in marginalized people, marginalized class. And then this marginalization and what determines marginalizations depend on our socio-cultural political factors. So Nepal case is different. It has different historical injustices done to what we say Dalits, lower caste people. So there is historical injustice to be corrected. Maybe to some very marginalized indigenous people. Yeah, these have to be done, and then how to be done. I think it's a big issue, and there needs to be a collaboration between all these things: social movements, scholars, and the policymakers. So that's my feeling. I hope this topic gets popular among the young people. So yeah, that's all from my side, and thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments. I think that really laid out an excellent historical context and kind of narrative of where the field came from. And in our conversation, that really came through, and it's really influenced my understanding of that historical development of the field in Nepal, and you've enriched that significantly as you've commented. So thank you for that. I see there's a hand up from Ram Timosina. There are a couple comments in the chat that maybe I'll go first, and then I'll come back to you, Ram. So the first one from Rajesh Paudel, how to relate inclusiveness in the food system from an environmental social justice perspective. Yeah, that's a great one. And, I didn't really cover that very much actually in the talk, and it's a really vital one. So there's a couple of different things to say about that. So there's the site of production. So a lot of the farm workers are heavily affected by environmental injustices, particularly pesticide exposures, but also the farm workers are living in towns and homes right near the fields, and so they're affected in their homes as well as at work by pesticides, air quality, water pollution based on agriculture. Then there's the issue at the site of consumption, where people, particularly low-income people, don't have access to healthy food. It's very different than in Nepal, where there's so much fresh food available, some that people grow or that you can buy on a, peddler on the street or in a shop. In a lot of places in the United States, they call them food deserts. There's just no fresh food around, and even the processed food is really expensive, and often even that is far away from people. So a lot of people just don't have access to that. And then there's the issue of sort of food sovereignty and cultural foodways, they sometimes say. So there's a lot of work now with indigenous people, African Americans, Asians, Latinos, to sort of reclaim their traditional foods as a way of cultural pride and cultural revitalization. So that's another really important part of food justice. So it kind of spans all of those dimensions. Okay, so then from Sama Dangal, this may be my assumption, but I see less social movements regarding EJ in Nepal. In this situation, how can constitutionally guaranteed rights come into effect if people, especially indigenous knowledge, do not actively come forward? Yeah, that's a really great question. So yeah, I would say, based on, as I was sharing before, there are really strong individual movements in Nepal, as I've been able to see so far on all the issues that I talked about. But the environmental justice frame, the kind of the discourse, the concepts, the language, that hasn't taken hold as much. There's some of that for sure. But it's just not as holistic and integrated. So I think that is a challenge, and I think that that's an opportunity for activists and scholars and policymakers in Nepal to begin to create that more holistic frame, and that and the Constitution does provide this incredible framework, like the executive order, but much more powerfully, to have that literally in your Constitution. In California, we had legislation passed almost 10 years ago now called the Human Right to Water, which wasn't legally binding, but it created this framework where all of the state agencies had to talk about how they were going to protect that human right to water. So, it's in our water code, not our state constitution, but it is our state law. So anyway, so that can be very powerful, and it can provide opportunities for when people do come forward to have something to refer to and to kind of provide as a legal justification for what their activism is. So I think that's a real resource, but they do need to come forward. That's not, we have a old civil rights leader, Frederick Douglass, here said that power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has, and it never will. So you have to come and meet power with power. Anil Prasad Kanal says, what kind of practices were applied to ensure civic engagement and policymaking police? I'm not sure. What do you mean by that, Anil, the police part? Do you mean like literally like the officers of the law police? I just wanted to clarify that word. Well, I'll leave that word out and just say kinds of practices to ensure civic engagement. So there are a number of different kinds of. Oh, go ahead. Was someone speaking?
It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So in terms of civic engagement, so a lot of different kinds of practices. So there's direct protests where people, and Nepal has certainly knows this well, but mass protests, civil disobedience. But there's also a lot of petitioning of the legislators. That there's very active dialogue in the democratic sense to lobby legislators and our governor, essentially our province minister, governor, to pass certain laws or oppose certain laws. There's also a lot of environmental justice activists getting more directly involved in politics through running for office themselves or being on government boards. So a lot of participation from within, coming into the agencies or into the government. So those are a number of different ways. Gambar Nepali says, in the Nepali context, as well as South Asian context, caste system plays the most crucial roles for shaping environmental justice and so on. How do you think this is being in the US context? Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And there's a great book, if you're interested in this, by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. And she looks at the issue of caste in the United States as being based in race and racism, that caste is as this sort of social hierarchy that race is sort of a key dimension in. And then she relates that to caste in South Asia and talks about the similarities. There's also been some really interesting work with relating Black Lives Matter with Dalit Lives Matter, and work by the Samatha Foundation. Some of you may know that Samatha Foundation, directed by Pradeep Pariyar, has been doing really interesting comparative work between Black Lives Matter in the US and other countries and Dalit rights work in Nepal and elsewhere in South Asia. So I think that's actually quite a powerful opportunity for thinking across our countries, US and Nepal. Okay, I think Ram, you've had your hand up for a while, so please let's hear your question.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm Ram Hari Timal Sinha. Basically, I'm affiliated to Agriculture and Forestry University of Nepal, and now I'm a student of Dr. Purna Nepali. I guess Jonathan is familiar with LDC countries like Nepal, and you see, we are nowadays we are heading towards urbanization, as Jagannath sir also rightly mentioned. But in Nepalese context, we think that urbanization means like building large structure, like concretization, this kind of things. Is the perception of people that exactly urbanization is this kind of things. But based on your expertise or experience to develop like green economy kinds of things, and like to develop some more resilient food system kinds of things. What do you suggest to suggest for to address the social and environmental justice in the development discourse of New Nepal from policy perspective, like we from policy intervention perspective, what is your suggestion for LDC like Nepal?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure you have some important thoughts about that as well. Yeah, I'd say a couple things. So first off, I really do agree that there's this problem of a paradigm of what it means to be modern, what it means to be urban. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the models of urbanization in Nepal, particularly in Kathmandu, but other cities as well, have a really destructive form of urbanism, of without zoning, just development based on land markets, not based on ecological or even social function, loss of green space, lots of they call it multimodal transportation. So streets, not just for cars, but streets also for bikes and pedestrians and public transit. So those things really need to be designed into cities. Again, just thinking about walkability, it's really hard to walk around Kathmandu now, and that was very different, or bike around for that matter, when I was here or there in the early 90s. It was very, very different. Loss of vernacular architecture and just a sense of place when things start to look more and more the same. You lose that sense of place, that cultural vision. Though that's kind of just about urbanization in general, but you also just have sort of the winners and losers of the urban system when it's a city built by and for the wealthy. The poor and the marginalized will suffer. So I do think coming up with different green and just visions of the city as Nepal urbanizes is critical, and that again is both ecological and social and political. So I think those are really, really crucial points. And I think, that gets back to the agriculture question a moment ago. I mean, urban agriculture, vertical agriculture, rooftop agriculture, those are really creative ideas. Pocket parks to make sure everyone has green space to recreate and just to get out of the busyness of the city. Those are all, very important dimensions as well. Benita Nepali says, women experience inequitable environmental burdens compared to men, though the gender perspective is hardly discussed while discussing environmental justice. How can it be addressed? Yeah, that's a great point. And I didn't do that as much as I could have in the talk. So, certainly that comes up in community forestry and anything to do with livelihoods, where women, as you know, probably better than many, shoulder so much of the burden and yet don't have the ownership rights of land or capital, and so are really dependent on men. And that, of course, is an added issue as men are increasingly, out of the country, earning remittance based salaries in the Gulf and Malaysia and other places, India. So you have this loss of population in the rural communities, women holding it down and not having the legal rights to that land. So tremendous gender disparity and a tremendous burden on women. Similar with the community forestry issues of what the kinds of work that women are responsible for, and the ways in which exclusionary policies in community forestry are felt by women. And it really goes across all of those different issues. So I do think that gender needs to be central in environmental justice, along with these other dimensions that we've talked about, caste and class and ethnicity and so on. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, I think those were all that are on the chat. Any other questions or comments?
Jonathan, should I do?
Please, yes.
Actually, I have a two concern, and how can the social movements can influence the public policy agency for influencing the policy in effective way. And so far, understand the people are agitating at the grassroots levels, and that really pressurizes the government or the public institution to influence. And I'm not a student of the social movement, and I'm a little bit curious to understand and what are the very effective strategy that social movement or social justice issues or very effective campaigning can influence the public policy. This is the one. My next concern is, as you are very well aware of the environment racisms, and what are the way of initiate some kind of environment casteism or different kind of the social justice issue in Nepal, caste, race, and regionalism or something like that. And what are the way of cross-cultural learning or cross-cultural solidarity between the US and Nepal, focusing on the racial justice or the social justice issue or racial justice with respect to the caste justice. And I have a two concern. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both excellent points and questions. Well, in terms of the social movement dimension, sort of the formula for successful social movements includes a couple things. So one is the development of a sort of a critical consciousness where a mass of people identify their own grievance, their own individual grievance with a larger collective issue. And so they move from just being an individual to being part of a larger entity, a movement. So they have to see the issue, they have to believe that something is possible to change, and they need to come to see that being part of a larger movement is going to help them achieve that goal. The movement itself needs to be able to have, both a visionary goal of what they ultimately want to achieve, but also sort of strategies along the way where you can kind of build up confidence and belief in your abilities, your efficacy. It needs to be able to build alliances. You talked about that term solidarity. That really is this central point, and I bring that up sort of repeatedly here. That for one of the powerful things about environmental justice in the U.S. and I think building in Nepal is the possibility of solidarity across all of these different social groups and places and issue areas. And so if you want to make a structural change, like in the relationship between, say, caste and environment, it can't just be people who are involved in air or just water or just forestry or just toxic waste. There needs to be cross-movement alliances and cross-population alliances, because the systems that you're going up against are so powerful. You have to have the people power to be able to have an equal and opposing force. And the only way you're going to do that is that kind of solidarity vertically in terms of, from sympathetic elites to the grassroots, and horizontally in terms of, a range of different kinds of organizations and a range of different kinds of places, all focused on one particular aim, and one particular social grievance and one particular social social vision. Yeah, and then yeah, I guess that would be the primary piece that I would make. And then, yeah, in terms of just the social justice dimensions, I mean, I know Pradeep Pariyar, but I think that the work that he's been doing to create solidarities between people working on racism and anti-racism in the United States around things like Black Lives Matter on the one hand, and then people who are working on Dalit rights and Dalit liberation work in Nepal and elsewhere in South Asia. I think it's just so important. I think it helps both groups see themselves more clearly. I think it creates this global solidarity movement. And I think it helps us see sort of like the deeper roots of these kinds of issues that we think are maybe just based on our own country, but it's actually much more profound than that. And when we talk with each other and we have these sorts of conversations that we're having like tonight, we can start to see some of those similarities and see some of the possibilities for solidarity.
Thank you, Professor Jonathan. Yeah, we have one more comment.
Okay, Amina Singh. So I found Jagannath Ji's thoughts and comments very insightful to enhance my understanding. As pointed out in the presentation, the fragmentation of movements across different social and geographic locations is an impediment. Solidarity building is very important. Yeah, I think Amina, that really speaks to the message that we've been talking about tonight. It really, if there's one thing I could leave you with, it is to both understand why there's fragmentation, and that is typically a very effective approach of the elites. If the elites can keep the people divided, whether that's by, again, all the social distinctions that we've talked about, gender, caste, class, race, language, ethnicity. If the people are divided, the elites are protected. But when the people come together across all of these different dimensions and they form these social movements, and those movements have grassroots membership, have professional advocates, have the scholars involved, have access to the policy domains, that's really powerful. And I will say, as many of you, not all of you, but many of you here are students and maybe younger faculty. Environmental justice really is a framework that you can use really regardless of the issues that you are looking at in particular, or I should say, regardless of having any one focus. Environmental justice can incorporate the things that you are doing and enrich it. And so I would suggest to you that you could probably all find something valuable to look at within environmental justice, and the resources that I shared at the end of the show with literature about Nepal. I think there's some excellent sources there that cover most of the issues we've talked about here: air, water, land, food, and so on, as well as some of the more classic works in the United States to give you some of that kind of conceptual framework. So yeah, if you can move towards synthesis and solidarity and away from fragmentation, that's a very powerful direction.
Great. If we don't have any other comments, I would like to move on to concluding this session. I tried to summarize or take some points that I thought were important. We started with just the social justice question, especially about thinking about who is making decisions in terms of environmental justice and policies. Then we looked at the framework, like the relationships of how environmental justice is tied to public policy, social movement, social justice, and science. And then we did this, we looked at the environmental justice issues and the history in the United States, especially looking at the 80s and afterwards. In Nepal.
Excuse me.
Hi. Sure, I can tell who is speaking.
Hello.
Yes, Rajesh ji.
Hi, I'm Rajesh Paudel. I'm from Tribhuvan University, Institute of Agriculture and Animal Science. I have a question to Dr. Jonathan London.
Could you make it brief, sir?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I'm a PhD scholar at Tribhuvan University, and I'm researching on under Dr. Poona Nepali. And my research theme is under inclusive transformation of agri-food system of Nepal. And I have a question to Dr. London. How can we relate different parameters of inclusiveness under major food system components? And how is there any available framework or relevant theory related with that research for inclusive transformation of agri-food system under major food components of Nepal?
Mm-hmm.
Can we relate different parameters of inclusiveness with different major components of food system?
Right. Well, that's a very big question with probably a very long answer that would be needed. I know we're kind of at the end. I know Risha was just giving sort of the closing remarks. So I'll just say a couple things, and then we could set up another time to talk. But I would just suggest to you a structural approach, looking at sort of the life cycle of agriculture. So from the sites of production and all of the different social and labor relations there, the larger social context around that production in terms of the laborers, where they live, how they live, what the impacts are, the whole value chain from processing to distribution, and then looking at the sites of consumption of what kind of food people have access to, the healthiness or non-healthiness of that. So that kind of value chain or commodity chain analysis, I think, is a really useful one. That kind of comes out of political economy, critical food studies. So that's where I would look. But as I say, I'd be happy to talk more with you and point you in the direction of some other resources. So Risha, I think you were trying to conclude us.
Sure. I think you can also discuss this later. You have shared your email as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so the next point I was gonna talk about was how we've already discussed this, but there's a lot of scope of research across different environmental justice that are working in silos right now, but how can they come together to move forward the social justice movement in environment? And we also pointed out how especially it's important in planning and in such a development based context, and there is a context of urbanization, such as building the roads and in the hills. There's a lot of talks about the dozer atanka, which means like the very pervasive road constructions that happened over the last few years. And we talked about how gender is also central in this issue, along with caste. And then it's important to build alliances across disciplines, groups, geographies, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it on to Ramji, unless you have something to add. Thank you.
That's great. That was a very nice summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Richa. You have rightly summarized the whole discussion. So thank you for that. So I'd like to thank Professor Jonathan for his valuable presentation and responding the queries that we had throughout the session. So I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to all the collaborators for making this event successful. I'd like to thank all the participants for your active participation. So we're at the end of session. So thank you all once again. So this kind of series will be in the following days as well. So we have another event tomorrow at 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. So I'd request all the participants to join that session as well. So thank you so much for all of you. So we're signing off from today's session. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ramji, Richa.